Hey everyone. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Lloyd Bitzer's idea of the rhetorical situation, focusing in on Bitzer's approach to audience in particular. So let's start off with what Bitzer says about audience. What is an audience? Bitzer says, an audience consists of persons who are capable of being influenced by discourse and of being mediators of change. In that quote, we could say discourse means language or communication. They're capable of being influenced by language or communication and being mediators of change. So we could summarize audience very easily as people who can do something about the initial problem or the initial exigence. Now, when I ask students the question, who is the audience, I often hear a very common answer that you see here, that it's a general audience. And I want to be talking to you today about why I think there are better answers out there for who the audience is, and why answering it's a general audience doesn't quite give us the data that we need when we're thinking about how to understand a rhetorical situation. So I want to pose this question to you. Does a general audience even exist? Let me walk you through what I'm thinking here. So point one right here at the top. Because a truly general audience, like again, basically everyone is a general audience, because a truly general audience is made up of so many conflicting opinions, interests, and desires, it would be difficult to identify any shared features of this audience. So, in other words, a general audience would be so big that we couldn't say anything specific about it because it includes literally everyone. So we can't really say, oh, they have this belief, or they live in this area, or they care about these things, because the audience is just too big to even generalize about in that way. So if a general audience, moving on to this second paragraph, lacks any shared features to appeal to, it would be almost impossible to craft a persuasive message that appeals to an audience that big. So really, we could say a general audience feels kind of like unpersuadable because we can't think of any specific features about them that we can use to then persuade them of something. So that leads me to conclude that a general audience might actually be an oxymoron, meaning it might not exist at all, because the premise is that audiences have specific features. They have specific beliefs, attitudes, and traits. So a general audience doesn't have any of those things. So really, that might not be an audience at all. And I wanted to talk to you about a kind of funny example of what we might call a general audience and how ineffective that might be. This comes from a television show called Veep. It's basically a satire of bad political candidates without any principles or morals or anything like that. So in this show, someone is running for president, presidential candidate Selina Meyer, and in order to appeal to a general audience, she crafts this political slogan: continuity with change. You'll notice that there's really nothing specific in that slogan at all. There's continuity and there's change. Things change and things stay the same. That's really what her slogan is. You can imagine how uninspiring a political slogan like that might be, since it basically says nothing at all. It says things change and things don't change. And that's the platform that this candidate is running on. If this is Selina Meyer's way of appealing to a general audience, you can imagine that it fails because it really doesn't say anything at all. So I want to give you some suggestions for how to avoid this, avoid thinking of a general audience and coming up with rhetoric that tries to appeal to a general audience and ultimately fails. So I'm going to encourage you to think like an advertiser or a good political strategist, as opposed to the last political strategist we just saw, who was very bad. So we know that advertisers and political strategists both try to identify narrow audiences with distinct desires, identities, and beliefs who will respond to their claims. And even while both advertisers and political strategies would certainly welcome like the biggest possible audience that they could ever reach, they also understand that they have to cater to very specific, narrow audiences to succeed. Let's look at two examples of what this might look like in practice. So let's think back to last fall. or fall 2020, when the presidential election was held. Because when you're thinking about politics, you might think, oh, the largest possible audience is who I'm trying to reach, because I literally want everyone to vote for me. So you conceivably think, oh, maybe this is a general audience. Well, first of all, no, because we're talking about an audience of US citizens who have the ability to vote. So already that's a smaller audience than a general audience, because it excludes people who aren't US citizens. It excludes people who don't have the right to vote. So that's already narrowing down the audience in certain ways. But I'd like to suggest to you that both political candidates last fall tried to reach even more narrow constituencies than a US audience of voters. So if we look at presidential candidate Trump, he sought to appeal to white working class men and women without college degrees, often without a history of voting in presidential elections. He was very successful with that particular demographic, so he often tailored his messages to that crowd. He sought to appeal to evangelical Christians, Cuban Americans living in Florida who had fears of socialism and socialist rhetoric, and of course, finally, people who live in states competitive in the Electoral College, like Pennsylvania and Florida. You'll notice a lot of states get ignored in the presidential election because they aren't really important decisive votes. They usually go one way or the other. So they kind of got ignored. On the other hand, presidential candidate Biden sought to appeal to Latinx voters and Black voters. He sought to appeal to white suburban women with college degrees, voters who identify as independent, neither Republican or Democrat. And then just like Trump, people who live in states competitive in the Electoral College, like Pennsylvania and Florida. Both of these candidates, while again, hoping for as many votes as possible, nevertheless tailored their messages to very specific audiences who they thought could give them the change that they were looking for. These are the people who were possible of making change that both of these candidates sought. They both want to win, essentially. So I give this example to say, even in a presidential election where you'd think that the audience is incredibly general, it's actually very, very specific in terms of who the presidential candidates are trying to reach. They have very specific, narrow audiences in mind. Let's look at one more example from just general advertisements. Most of us are familiar with the car ride service Uber. It's available worldwide. It's available in the US, it's available in many other countries, and it's available in both cities and rural locations. It's really in a lot of places. But when you look at this advertisement, you can see that Uber isn't trying to reach literally everyone. They seem to have a very specific audience in mind who presumably they believe will give them the most business, give them the most payout, which seems to be what they're after. So if you look at this ad, you can kind of deduce, after spending a few minutes looking at what's pictured here, that Uber is targeting, in this advertisement, looks like urban people, they're in a city, wealthy people, they're talking about black tie, upper class, again, black tie, white, adult, heterosexual, cisgender men and women. So again, while Uber would welcome business from literally anyone, they're targeting very specific audiences because they, for whatever reason, believe that those audiences are going to give them the most business or will be the most receptive to what they offer. So again, this is another example of how most people communicate to very specific, narrow audiences. With those two examples in mind, I just want to offer a few conclusions. As we've seen, most rhetoric tries to persuade a narrow, carefully defined audience. When you are trying to determine the audience of a piece of existing rhetoric, it can be helpful to ask yourself questions about demographic categories to help you narrow it down. This is always my first suggestion to a student who is wondering about who the audience is. Ask yourself these questions. Who do you think is the target age group? Who do you think is the target gender? What is the target class level? Upper class, middle class, lower class? What's the target education level? Racial identity, sexual orientation, geographic region, and so forth and so on. Those questions can really help you to paint a much more specific picture of an audience that a piece of rhetoric is trying to meet. And I would really encourage you to ask yourself those questions as you work on Project 2, where you try to identify an audience, and Project 3, when you try to engineer a new audience for your remediation. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone.